Every theory in science must pass one fundamental test. It doesn't matter how elegant it sounds, how beautifully it explains the world, or how desperately we want it to be true. If it contradicts itself, if its own components fight against each other, if the theory cannot remain internally consistent, then it fails. And it fails completely. Einstein's early theories of relativity had to pass this test. Quantum mechanics had to pass it. Even the most basic mathematical principles, addition, subtraction, the concept of zero, they all had to prove they could exist without contradicting themselves. This is called the consistency test. And it's merciless, because once you find even a single internal contradiction, once you discover that a theory's own rules make it impossible, the entire framework collapses. Not gradually, not partially, instantly, completely, permanently. Now here's the question that should keep philosophers awake at night. What happens when we apply this same test to God? Not just any conception of God, but the God of classical theology, the God that billions are told to believe in, the God defined as all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, the God that philosophers and theologians have spent centuries refining, defending, and declaring to be the most consistent, most logical, most rock-solid concept in all of human thought. What happens when you take that definition and subject it to the same rigorous consistency test that every scientific theory must face? Here's what we're about to discover. Consistency isn't just a nice-to-have feature in logical thinking. It's the baseline requirement, the bare minimum. Because if your definition contains internal contradictions, if the very attributes you use to describe something make that thing impossible to exist, then you're not describing anything real. You're describing a logical impossibility, like a married bachelor, like a square circle, like the sound of silence, words that seem meaningful, but describe absolutely nothing that can exist in reality. And when you apply the consistency test to the classical definition of God, when you examine whether omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence can actually coexist without contradicting each other, the results are devastating, not because we want them to be, not because of bias or prejudice or personal agenda, but because the mathematics of logic don't lie, the rules of consistency don't bend, and contradictions simply cannot exist. By the end of this analysis, you won't just see arguments or opinions. You'll see test results, cold, clear, undeniable test results that reveal whether the most fundamental religious concept in human history can pass the most basic requirement of logical existence. The consistency test begins now. Before we examine God, let's understand exactly what we're dealing with. A consistency test is simple in concept, brutal in application. You take a theory, a definition, a set of claims, and you check whether they can all be true at the same time. In physics, this test has destroyed entire worldviews. Classical mechanics seemed perfect for centuries. It explained motion, predicted planetary orbits, built the foundation of engineering. But when scientists pushed it to extreme speeds, contradictions emerged. The theory claimed that nothing could exceed a certain velocity, while simultaneously predicting that things could. The math broke down. The framework collapsed. That's when Einstein stepped in, with relativity. In mathematics, this happens constantly. Consider Russell's paradox, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? or not. Either answer creates a contradiction. The paradox didn't just challenge one small corner of mathematics. It revealed that the entire logical foundation needed rebuilding. Why is consistency so merciless? Because logic operates on a fundamental principle. Contradictions cannot exist in reality. If your theory says both A is true and A is false about the same thing, in the same way, at the same time, then your theory describes nothing real. It's not that contradictions are unlikely or improbable. They're impossible. Period. Now, let's examine what we're testing. The God of classical theism isn't some vague spiritual force or abstract concept. Philosophers and theologians have spent nearly 2 millennia crafting a precise definition, built on 3 essential attributes. First, omnipotence. God possesses unlimited power. He can do anything that is logically possible without restriction or limitation. Second, omniscience. God possesses perfect knowledge. He knows every fact, every possibility, every detail of past, present, and future reality. Third, omnibenevolence. God possesses perfect goodness. He is not just morally flawless. He is the very standard of moral perfection itself. These aren't optional features. They're not nice-to-have additions. According to classical theism, remove any one of these attributes, and you no longer have God. You have something else entirely. Take away omnipotence, and you might have a powerful being, but not the creator of everything. Take away omniscience, and you might have a wise architect, but not the perfect mind that knows all things. Take away omnibenevolence, and you might have a mighty ruler, but not a being worthy of worship and devotion. All 3 must exist simultaneously, perfectly, without limitation. Thomas Aquinas built this framework in the 13th century. Descartes refined it in the 17th. Generations of theologians have defended it as the most logically coherent, most rationally defensible conception of the divine ever formulated. They claim it's not just consistent, it's perfectly consistent, unshakable, bulletproof. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take these 3 attributes, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, and run them through the same consistency test that every scientific theory must pass. The methodology is straightforward. Internal consistency check. We're not looking for outside evidence. We're not examining historical claims or miracle reports. We're simply asking, can these 3 attributes coexist without contradicting each other? Can unlimited power, perfect knowledge, and perfect goodness exist in the same being at the same time without creating logical impossibilities? This isn't about what we want to be true. It's about what can logically be true. And the stakes couldn't be higher. Because if this definition fails the consistency test, if these attributes contradict each other, then the classical God doesn't exist. Not probably, not maybe. Definitively. The test parameters are set. The definition is clear. Let's see what the results show us. We begin with the attribute that sounds most straightforward, omnipotence. All-powerful, unlimited ability, can do anything. But the moment you try to define anything precisely, a devastating question emerges. Can God create a stone so heavy that he himself cannot lift it? At first glance, this might seem like a clever riddle, a philosophical word game, but look closer. This is a formal logical structure that exposes a fundamental flaw. There are only 2 possible answers. Yes, or no. If the answer is yes, if God can create such a stone, then by definition, there exists something he cannot do: lift that stone. Therefore, he is not omnipotent. If the answer is no, if God cannot create such a stone, then again, there exists something he cannot do: create that stone. Therefore, he is not omnipotent. Both answers lead to the same conclusion. Omnipotence, as defined, contains an internal contradiction. This isn't wordplay. This is mathematics. This is the logic of self-reference, revealing that absolute power is logically incoherent. Think of it this way. Omnipotence claims to include the power to limit itself. But if it can limit itself, then it's not unlimited. And if it cannot limit itself, then it's already limited. The contradiction is built into the very concept. Now, defenders of omnipotence have recognized this problem for centuries. And their most common response is this: God transcends logic. He's not bound by human reasoning. But watch what happens when you take this seriously. If God transcends logic, then logical categories no longer apply to him. Words like powerful, good, knowledgeable. All of these depend on logical relationships to have meaning. If logic doesn't bind God, then when we say God is good, that statement becomes meaningless. Because goodness is a logical concept. It has definition, structure, coherence. Remove logic, and you remove the ability to meaningfully define anything about God at all. So the escape route: God transcends logic, doesn't save omnipotence. It destroys the entire framework of classical theism. But there's an even deeper problem: the self-referential paradox. Omnipotence means having the power to do anything. But anything would include the power to eliminate one's own power. So omnipotence must include the ability to make oneself non-omnipotent. But if you can lose omnipotence, then you were never truly omnipotent in the first place. Because true omnipotence would include the power to remain omnipotent forever. The concept devours itself. Theologians have tried dozens of ways to escape this trap. Let's examine the most popular attempts. God can do anything that is logically possible. This sounds reasonable, but it immediately limits omnipotence. If God cannot do the logically impossible, then he is not all-powerful. He is bound by the laws of logic. This fundamentally changes the definition. Plus, it doesn't solve the original problem. Creating an unliftable stone is logically possible. Lifting any stone is logically possible. The contradiction emerges from trying to do both simultaneously with the same being. The question itself is meaningless. Some argue that asking about stones God cannot lift is like asking about square circles, a category error. But this misses the point. We're not asking about impossible objects. We're asking about the internal consistency of omnipotence itself. The stone is just an illustration. The real question is whether absolute power can be coherently defined. God chooses not to create such stones. This completely misses the logical structure. The question isn't whether God would create such a stone. The question is whether he could. And if he cannot, then he's not omnipotent. If he can, then there's something he cannot do: lift it. So he's still not omnipotent. Choice doesn't resolve logical contradiction. Power operates differently at the divine level. This is another appeal to mystery disguised as explanation. If divine power operates by completely different rules, then we cannot call it power in any meaningful sense. We're back to destroying the definition. To save it, every escape route leads to the same destination. Either you abandon omnipotence as absolute, or you abandon meaningful definitions altogether. Omnipotence contains internal contradictions that make it logically impossible. The concept cannot exist as defined. The first attribute of classical theism has failed the consistency test. But we're just getting started. Now we move from testing individual attributes to testing their compatibility. Can omniscience and omnipotence coexist in the same being? Here's the critical question. If God knows the future with perfect certainty, can He change it? Think about this carefully. Perfect foreknowledge means God knows exactly what will happen tomorrow, next year, 1,000 years from now, every detail, every outcome, with absolute certainty. But if God possesses omnipotence, unlimited power, then He should be able to alter any future event. He should be able to intervene, modify, redirect the course of history at will. So which is it? If God can change the future, then His knowledge wasn't perfect. He was wrong about what would happen. Therefore, He is not omniscient. If God cannot change the future, then there is something He cannot do. Therefore, He is not omnipotent. Both attributes cannot be true simultaneously. Perfect knowledge conflicts with unlimited power, but the contradiction goes deeper. Consider free will. Classical theism claims humans have genuine choice. But if God knows with certainty that John will choose chocolate ice cream tomorrow at 3 p.m., then John's choice is already fixed. It's not free. It's predetermined by God's infallible knowledge. Yet if humans don't have free will, then God is ultimately responsible for all evil actions. And this destroys omnibenevolence, our third attribute. So perfect foreknowledge eliminates either omnipotence or free will. And without free will, perfect goodness becomes impossible. One contradiction triggers a cascade failure. Let's examine this from another angle. The nature of information itself. Can an omniscient being learn anything new? By definition, no. Omniscience means knowing everything already. There's no new information to acquire, because all information is already known. But here's the problem. Can an omnipotent being create new information? By definition, yes. Omnipotence means the ability to do anything, including generating novel facts, new realities, unprecedented situations. Now, we have a direct contradiction. Omnipotence implies the ability to create new information. Omniscience implies no new information is possible. Consider this scenario. Can an omnipotent God surprise an omniscient God? If yes, then the omniscient aspect was incomplete. It didn't know the surprise was coming. If no, then the omnipotent aspect is limited. It cannot create genuine surprise. The attributes don't just conflict. They're mutually exclusive. Perfect knowledge makes unlimited power impossible. Unlimited power makes perfect knowledge impossible. Here's why. Unlimited power must include the power to act spontaneously, to make genuinely free choices, to create genuinely novel situations. But perfect knowledge requires that all future actions and outcomes are already known and fixed. You cannot have spontaneous omnipotence and predetermined omniscience in the same being. The mathematics of information theory makes this clear. Perfect predictability and genuine creativity cannot coexist. These aren't just abstract philosophical problems. They create concrete contradictions in religious practice. Prayer and intervention. If God already knows the future perfectly, what purpose does prayer serve? Believers pray, asking God to change outcomes, heal the sick, protect loved ones, alter circumstances. But if the future is already known with certainty, then either prayer changes nothing, God already knew what would happen, or prayer changes everything, God's knowledge was incomplete. Neither option preserves both omniscience and omnipotence. Prophecy, paradox. Religious texts contain prophecies, predictions of future events, but prophecies create a logical trap. If prophecies must come true, protecting omniscience, then the future is fixed and omnipotence cannot alter it. If prophecies can fail, preserving omnipotence's ability to change things, then omniscience was wrong. Divine plans. Classical theism claims God has eternal, perfect plans, but plans imply goals not yet achieved. Perfect knowledge implies all goals are already known to be achieved, or not. Unlimited power implies the ability to abandon or modify any plan. The concept of divine planning requires uncertainty and limitation. Neither is compatible with the omni attributes. Consider the ultimate example, salvation. If God knows with certainty who will be saved and who will be damned, can his omnipotence override that knowledge? If yes, the knowledge was imperfect. If no, the power is limited. Every practical application of both attributes simultaneously leads to contradiction. Omniscience and omnipotence cannot coexist. They are logically mutually exclusive. Perfect knowledge eliminates unlimited power. Unlimited power eliminates perfect knowledge. Two attributes down, one to go. But the final test will be the most devastating of all. The first two tests examined internal logical consistency. This test examines external empirical consistency. We're asking, do the observable facts of reality match what omnipotence plus omnibenevolence would predict? Here's what perfect goodness combined with unlimited power should produce: a world with minimal necessary suffering and maximum flourishing. Perfect goodness means God would want to prevent all unnecessary pain. Unlimited power means he could prevent it. Together, they create a clear, testable prediction. But what do we actually observe? Unnecessary suffering. Everywhere. Constant. Massive. Overwhelming. Consider bone cancer in children. A 5-year-old screaming in agony as their skeleton dissolves from the inside. What lesson does this teach? What greater good does this serve? What moral development requires a child to experience this specific torture? There is no answer that preserves both perfect goodness and unlimited power. Either God lacks the goodness to care about this child's agony, or he lacks the power to prevent it. Both options destroy the classical definition. Natural disasters provide even clearer test cases. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami killed 230,000 people in minutes. Entire families swept away. Children torn from parents' arms. Communities obliterated. What human choice caused this? What free will was being preserved? What moral lesson required 250,000 deaths? If God is perfectly good, he would want to prevent this senseless destruction. If God is omnipotent, he could prevent it with less effort than we use to blink. The earthquake that triggered the tsunami was entirely within the scope of divine power to stop. Yet he didn't. The empirical data directly contradicts the theoretical prediction. But perhaps individual tragedies don't tell the full story. Let's examine the scale systematically. If perfect goodness and unlimited power exist together, we would expect suffering to be minimal in quantity, necessary for some greater purpose. distributed fairly, proportionate to any lessons being taught. What we actually observe: suffering is massive and constant. Most suffering serves no discernible purpose. Suffering is concentrated among the most vulnerable. The scale far exceeds any conceivable educational need. Run the numbers. At any given moment, millions of people are experiencing severe physical pain. Millions more are enduring psychological torture, depression, anxiety, grief. Millions face starvation, disease, natural disasters. If this were a designed system, overseen by perfect goodness and unlimited power, it would represent a catastrophic failure of management. Consider this statistical reality. A perfectly good, all-powerful being should be able to achieve any educational or spiritual goals with precisely the minimum suffering required. Yet we observe suffering levels that are orders of magnitude beyond any conceivable necessity. It's like using a nuclear weapon to light a candle. The disproportion between means and ends reveals either incompetence, limited power, or indifference, limited goodness. The scale of observed suffering is statistically incompatible with the omni attributes. Faced with this data, defenders typically respond, "God works in mysterious ways." But mystery is not an explanation. It's the absence of explanation. And in a consistency test, vague non-explanations count as failures. Here's why. If omniscience and omnibenevolence exist together, God knows exactly which interventions would produce the best outcomes. His actions should be precisely calibrated to achieve maximum good with minimum suffering. This creates specific, measurable predictions. Divine interventions should be consistently beneficial. Suffering should correlate with clear moral purposes. The amount of pain should match the importance of the lesson. Innocent suffering should be virtually non-existent. But mysterious ways abandons all specific predictions. It makes the theory unfalsifiable by claiming any outcome, no matter how contradictory, is somehow consistent with perfect goodness and power. This violates basic logical consistency. You cannot define God as perfectly good, then explain away obviously evil outcomes by appealing to mystery. Either goodness has meaning, in which case certain things are clearly not good, or it doesn't, in which case the attribute becomes meaningless. The precision problem reveals that defenders must choose, maintain specific definitions that can be tested, or retreat into vagueness that cannot be defended. Let's make this concrete with a simple scenario. A child is drowning in a pond. You have the power to save them with no risk to yourself. Perfect goodness demands you act. Unlimited power makes action effortless. Now scale this up. Every day, thousands of children die from easily preventable causes: malnutrition, dehydration, treatable diseases. An omnipotent, perfectly good God could save them all, with less effort than we use to think about it. Yet the drowning continues. This creates an impossible situation. If God acts to save some, but not others, his choices appear arbitrary, destroying perfect goodness. If God saves none, he violates perfect goodness. If God saves all, we wouldn't observe the current levels of preventable death and suffering. The observable divine inaction in the face of preventable suffering is direct empirical evidence against the omni attributes. Consider the theological implications. Perfect goodness requires opposing unnecessary suffering. Omnipotence makes opposition effortless. Yet we observe systematic divine inaction in the face of massive preventable suffering. This isn't a philosophical puzzle. It's contradictory data. When a perfectly good, all-powerful being systematically fails to prevent preventable suffering, we must conclude that being does not exist as defined. The action-inaction paradox shows that divine silence itself is evidence, not evidence of mystery, but evidence of absence. The observable reality of suffering directly contradicts what omnipotence plus omnibenevolence predicts. The scale, precision, and consistency of this contradiction cannot be explained away by appeals to mystery or unknown purposes. All three attributes have failed the consistency test, but the compound failure is even worse than the sum of its parts. Let's step back and examine what we've discovered. Test 1 revealed that omnipotence contradicts itself. The concept of absolute power creates paradoxes that make it logically impossible to exist. Test 2 showed that omniscience and omnipotence are mutually exclusive. Perfect knowledge eliminates unlimited power. Unlimited power eliminates perfect knowledge. Test 3 demonstrated that omnibenevolence plus omnipotence predicts a reality completely different from what we observe. The empirical data contradicts the theoretical claims. 3 separate failures, 3 different types of contradictions. But here's what makes this devastating. You cannot fix one without breaking another. Limit omnipotence to resolve the paradox. You lose the unlimited power needed for Test 2 and Test 3. Restrict omniscience to allow genuine choice. You eliminate the perfect knowledge required for classical theism. Qualify omnibenevolence to explain suffering. You abandon the moral perfection that defines God. Every attempted solution creates new contradictions. The attributes don't just fail individually. They form an interconnected web of impossibilities. What we're witnessing isn't random failure. It's systematic breakdown at every level. Internal, logical contradictions. The definition contradicts itself from within. Omnipotence is self-defeating. The knowledge-power interaction is impossible. External, empirical contradictions. The definition contradicts observable reality. The predicted world and the actual world are incompatible. Definitional collapse. Each escape route destroys the meaning of the terms being rescued. Mystery makes goodness meaningless. Transcending logic makes power indefinable. The classical definition of God doesn't just fail the consistency test, it fails spectacularly, from every angle, at every level, in every possible way. This isn't a minor theological problem that needs refinement. This is complete, systematic failure. The definition is eating itself alive. The classical God, defined as omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, cannot pass basic consistency requirements. The concept is internally contradictory, externally falsified, and definitionally incoherent. This is not opinion. This is mathematical conclusion. The consistency test that every legitimate theory must pass, the classical God cannot pass. Now, if you followed this analysis, you might be anticipating the objections. The escape routes defenders will try to use. Let's examine the 3 most common responses and why they fail. The argument goes like this. Our human reasoning is flawed. God operates beyond our logical categories. Divine truth transcends human understanding. But notice what this response does. It uses the very logic it claims is inadequate to make its point. The statement, human logic is limited, is itself a logical claim. That assumes human logic is reliable enough to recognize its own limitations. This is self-defeating. You cannot use reason to argue that reason doesn't apply. You cannot employ logical structure to claim that logic is inadequate for the topic. More importantly, this response destroys the original definition entirely. Classical theism was built using human logic. Aquinas used logic. Descartes used logic. Every philosophical argument for God's existence relies on logical principles. You cannot use logic to construct the definition, then abandon logic when the definition fails. That's not theological sophistication. That's intellectual dishonesty. If logic doesn't apply to God, then we cannot meaningfully call him good, powerful, or knowing. Those are logical categories. Remove logic, and you remove the ability to define God at all. This response treats contradiction as if it were merely unknown information. We don't understand God's ways. His purposes are beyond our comprehension. But mystery is not the same as contradiction. Mystery means we lack information. Contradiction means the information we have is logically impossible. The difference is crucial. When scientists encounter unknown phenomena, that's mystery. There's more to learn. When mathematicians find that 2 + 2 = 5 in a particular system, that's contradiction. The system is broken. Our analysis didn't reveal mysteries about God. It revealed logical impossibilities. You cannot defend impossibilities by calling them mysteries. Moreover, undefined terms cannot be defended. If God's nature is completely mysterious, then statements like, God is good, become meaningless. You cannot simultaneously claim to know that God has certain attributes, while claiming those attributes are beyond understanding. The mystery defense abandons the consistency principle entirely. It says any contradiction can be explained away by appealing to unknowability. But this makes every concept equally defensible, no matter how incoherent. This final retreat suggests that where reason fails, faith succeeds. That belief can overcome logical contradictions, but faith cannot fix impossibilities. Faith might help you trust despite incomplete information, but it cannot make contradictions coherent. Consider the difference. Trusting a bridge engineer's calculations when you can't verify them yourself. That's reasonable. Faith. Believing a bridge can simultaneously exist and not exist. That's not faith. That's accepting impossibility. Faith, properly understood, operates in areas where evidence is incomplete but not contradictory. It bridges uncertainty, not impossibility. When defenders appeal to faith to overcome logical contradictions, they're not demonstrating spiritual courage. They're abandoning the consistency principle that makes rational discourse possible. This response essentially argues that God can be both A and not A simultaneously. But this destroys meaning itself. In a universe where contradictions are acceptable, every statement becomes meaningless, because its opposite is equally valid. None of these counterarguments rescue the classical definition. They either destroy their own foundations or abandon the principles that make rational discussion possible. The results are clear. The classical God, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, cannot pass basic consistency requirements. This isn't a matter of opinion or personal belief. This is about logical coherence, and the classical definition lacks it, fundamentally. This matters for honest intellectual inquiry, because it shows that even our most cherished concepts must submit to rational analysis. No idea, no matter how traditional or comforting, gets a free pass from the consistency test. The implications extend beyond theology. Any worldview that contains internal contradictions will eventually collapse under scrutiny. The consistency test isn't just for God. It's for every truth claim we make about reality. When we demand consistency in our worldviews, something remarkable happens. We're forced to confront uncomfortable truths, abandon cherished contradictions, and build more coherent understandings of existence. This is what rigorous thinking about fundamental questions achieves. It strips away the comfortable impossibilities we cling to and challenges us to construct beliefs that can withstand logical scrutiny. Moving forward with intellectual honesty means accepting that some traditional ideas will fail these tests. But that's not a loss. It's progress. Every failed theory clears space for better ones. The classical God fails the consistency test, but this failure opens up possibilities. For more coherent approaches to meaning, morality, and existence itself, I challenge you to apply this same consistency test to your own fundamental beliefs. Pick any concept you hold as unquestionably true and examine it for internal contradictions. Can your worldview's components coexist without contradicting each other? Do your deepest convictions make predictions that match observable reality? If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe for more rigorous examination of fundamental questions, and share your own consistency test results in the comments. What beliefs have you discovered contain hidden contradictions? Because the goal isn't to destroy cherished ideas for the sake of destruction. It's to build more solid foundations for understanding reality. The consistency test continues. The question is, what will you test next?